All right, we can go ahead and get started here. Thank you all for joining us today for our webinar, Understanding the Modern Learner. My name is Bryan Ashton. I serve as the Chief Strategy and Growth Officer with Trellis, but also have the privilege of heading up our Trellis Strategies team. We're here today to talk a little bit about this concept of what we call the modern learner, and we recently hosted a summit in Texas to talk about sort of this framework for modern learners. And I'm excited to spend some time with you all today, kind of talking through the idea of the modern learner. For those of you who may not be familiar, Trellis Strategies is a nonprofit research and technical assistance organization that has over 3 decades of higher education research. And so in 2024, we produced over 515 reports for over 300 partner institutions. And this year we'll serve over 350 institutions around the country. And we're really excited about the opportunity to bring what we call learner voice to the conversation. And so you'll see there that we, since 2018, have surveyed over 5.3 million learners, and we continue to grow that number every year. And a lot of those insights are insights that we are able to derive for our kind of conversations here today as we think about sort of where the modern learner is evolving to. So we began this conversation about 2 years ago when we launched Trellis Strategies about what we are now calling the modern learner. And this was built out of our work for learner voice and this acknowledgement that learners of all ages are changing. And there's been a lot of conversations in higher education about what we call, quote unquote, adult learners or learners that are over the age of 25. We do not see this terminology, the modern learner terminology, as replacing that of adult learners. We do also believe that most people who are enrolled in post-secondary education are adult learners, but rather what we see in our conversations with learners across the country is that no matter the age or demographics of the individual, that their expectations of higher education or post-secondary education are changing. And given the way that the world is changing, that's not a bad thing, right? And so as we talk through today, we'll talk through sort of how we view the modern learner, some data points that help to support the modern learner architecture, if you will, that we've kind of adopted across the organization, and then some key considerations both for institutions and systems as we think about how we evolve to support these learners. Core to sort of this idea of the modern learner is the idea that we developed a system, if you will, of post-secondary education and training that was very linear in nature. And so many of you are probably intimately familiar with this kind of linear pathway here where individuals receive a high school diploma or an equivalent. Some individuals may have taken dual credit while they were enrolled in high school. And then they progress to an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree. And hopefully, if they get an associate's degree, we can stack that into a bachelor's degree. But then ultimately, graduate school becomes sort of a vehicle, if you will, for lifelong learning. And sort of the irony of this entire pathway for individuals is that we developed a financing structure that was tied to this, right? So from a Pell Grant perspective, we have lifetime maximums or aggregates that students experience. And we really kind of created the Graduate Plus loan, which has now been changed as a part of the reconciliation bill that passed earlier this year, to be sort of our vehicle for lifelong learning for individuals. And that isn't the case when we think about the aggregate lifetime maximums that are included in both graduate and professional programs. And so as we think about sort of this evolution, this linear pathway was supported by the financing. It was supported by sort of how we talked about post-secondary education access to individuals. As we think about where students are now, though, increasingly they're experiencing post-secondary education and training in a nonlinear format. And so for some individuals that might be completing a high school or equivalency, it might be joining the workforce for a few years and then starting an associate's degree for a few terms. Throughout that associate's degree, it might be obtaining skills and courses that lead to a job or employment. They may then go back to school and receive a non-degree credential and then continue later to pursue their associate's degree, and then even later in life begin their bachelor's degree. This is one of many pathways that individuals may take as post-secondary training becomes more nonlinear. But the reality here is that you'll see each of these sort of kind of points here are starting and stopping points for their formal education journeys. And we expect that that will continue. So students will start and stop at different times to begin to get either a non-degree credential or a credential, degreed credential, excuse me, at different parts in their lives. Part of this is due to the fact that our technical skills, and in particular technical skills, but all skills, are having a shortened half-life. And so as we think about sort of the need to keep up with the evolution of industry and work, we're going to need more training opportunities throughout this sort of nonlinear pathway for individuals. Additionally, as we think about students that are coming in and leaving post-secondary education at different times, one of the things that we realize throughout that process is that they come to us as post-secondary education with different personas. And these personas require different flexibility, relevance, and support to help individuals to maintain their enrollment in their education. We see this with students who identify as an employee first and a student second. We also see this as students who are caregivers. But most importantly, as you begin to stack these alternative personas on top of being a student, two things happen. One is we increase what we call time poverty within the student body. And so these students have more competing priorities for their time, which leave less time for education. The second is that as there are conflicts within those personas, the student persona is less likely to win out. And so if we think about sort of historical student retention literature, one of the things that we'll see is that a lot of that literature was derived at more classic place-based institutions where students who were enrolled there were enrolled with student as their primary persona. Now, as we kind of talk to students, even those who are enrolled at some of those more selective place-based institutions, we see that student persona is falling further and further down their persona list in terms of how they identify, which means that if I have an employment conflict, or if I have a child care or caregiving conflict, those conflicts are going to win out over student. Ultimately, what this means, and as we talk about the modern learner, one of the things that we'll talk about is this need for the systems that we all operate in to adapt to learners, as opposed to asking learners to adapt to us. And that becomes more true the more that we believe that these alternative personas are key to how students identify. And so when student was the primary persona that individuals showed up to campus with, it is a lot easier to ask them to evolve their lives to meet the academy, if you will, or the institution. But if they're coming with other personas as primary, it's going to be a lot more difficult to ask those individuals to adapt to the work that we are doing as traditional post-secondary education. The other piece is that as individuals' personas change and as they come in and out of education in a nonlinear way, their perceptions of value change. And so I think probably everybody, if you've opened up some form of popular media over the last few years, has seen a poll or multiple polls that show that consumer confidence in post-secondary education is falling, and that is at the lowest point that it has been in a very long time. I think it still is slightly more popular than Congress, but I don't think it is carrying much more popularity right now than Congress. And so we've had sort of this broken trust, if you will, between the public and post-secondary education. And in many ways, that's not surprising. If we think about this idea that over 40 million Americans have some college and no credential, this is sort of what, from a net promoter perspective, if you will, these are detractors from the brand, right? These are individuals, if you're a degree or two of separation from somebody who started college and didn't finish, and very often is carrying debt and other kind of negative connotations with them about their experience, it shouldn't be surprising that that kind of permeates out into the broader populace and harms, if you will, sort of the brand of post-secondary education. But also we're seeing that cost is going up, right? And so there's two parts to cost. There's the direct cost, which actually as an industry, we've done a fairly good job of managing over the last 5 or so years. But there's also the indirect cost, the cost of living, your room and board, housing, other components. And that does continue to increase as our cost of living across the country continues to increase. And so we still see rising financial costs that individuals are engaging with. But we also see rising opportunity costs, especially during and coming out of the pandemic as wages rose in many parts of the country. That ability to earn was kind of offsetting sort of where we were from a kind of a enrollment perspective. And so those outcomes or how people perceive the outcomes changes, and we need to have sort of a different conversation about what people are expecting from post-secondary education. As we think about this, we kind of think about sort of three different distinct student personas: those that are leaving direct from high school, those that are in their early career, probably have not completed a degree or credential, may have some college, no credential, and those that are mid-career and they may have a degree or credential, or they might have none, may have not started, a degree or credential. But ultimately, what kind of changes is that two things: as individuals go through sort of that, direct from high school, early to mid-career, and then even further, it is less likely that student will be their primary persona. And aligned with that, it's also more likely that they will have a higher return pressure for post-secondary education. So as these lives become increasingly complex, there's more caregiving and other responsibilities. We have a higher expectation of return on investment. But we also have a lower window to achieve that return on investment, right? And so this leads to people looking at things like shorter term credentials or non-degree credentials. Leads to things like workforce or short-term Pell, which we also saw enacted as a part of the reconciliation bill. But we're really trying to compress some of these educational pursuits into smaller windows, and that leads to a better kind of runway, if you will, or a shorter runway, if you will, to a higher wage. The trade-off in many of these conversations is that the skills and what you're able to achieve from a shorter degree program isn't going to be as long from a half-life perspective as what we might expect out of a bachelor's degree or an associate's degree. And so then those reskilling loops become more and more frequent for individuals, because we can't expect that there will be a 20 or 30 year earning premium on a 6 or 9 month training program, right? In the same way that we maybe have expected from the signaling that comes out of the bachelor's degree environment. And so, this, I think, for us is important to understand that, as individuals are moving more through a nonlinear pathway to a degree or credential, that it's also changing their expectations of post-secondary education. So as we think about sort of what we define as the modern learner, there's sort of 6 key things that we are looking at for post-secondary education as being levers of evolution that we need to be paying attention to. The first is that, like I said earlier, students are increasingly experiencing nonlinear pathways as the primary way that they are consuming education. We are set up to handle linear pathways. We are not set up as a field, if you will, to handle nonlinear. And a big part of that is because we have really a lot of challenges with credit portability. And so the second piece here is credit portability and skill recognition. And for a nonlinear pathway to work, it means that individuals will be attending more institutions across the course of their life. And that we need to find ways to create sort of that learner record, if you will, that allows for individuals to come in and out of institutions, but still get credit for the experiences that they've accrued. The second part of that is that as they come in and out of education in the workforce, they're also going to be acquiring skills. And so we've seen this with credit for prior learning and competency-based education. We've seen very clear crosswalks, like, for example, with Department of Defense into academic settings for skill recognition. But there's more that we can do to make sure that we are continuing to evaluate student learning in all settings throughout the duration of their life. They may have received a logistics training from Walmart that would mirror or arguably exceed what they might have received at a local institution. And so how do we make sure that we're recognizing those experiences as individuals come in and out of post-secondary education? The third part is that our affordability and financing ecosystem has changed, and that we've set up again for sort of a very linear pathway in financing. And we'll talk more about this here in the next few slides. But this idea that individuals' lives from a financing perspective really can't be separated out from education, and that this isn't sort of the traditional, here's your award letter, come to school and go for 4 years, but rather that we're going to be thinking about lifelong training as a part of a financial picture that individuals are engaging with. Fourth piece is that individuals increasingly are having shorter duration experiences, and that we need to make sure that we are providing those experiences as an industry in a way that allows us to signal credential quality assurance, but also that sets reasonable expectations for the outcomes that are associated with those shorter duration experiences. So I live in Texas, and we've passed House Bill 8, which will fund non-degree credentials. The federal government, in sort of the first really state-federal partnership, has passed Workforce Pell, which will also fund some of these shorter degree credentials. But as a part of that, we have to be realistic about sort of, one, what is the duration of impact that we can expect from these experiences? And then two, how do we make sure that we signal quality as these programs become more and more accessible using financing vehicles? We're going to need to find a way to work through sort of the maze of credentials that are available to signal quality to learners throughout that process. And then finally, this idea here of kind of making sure that we have a student-centered delivery model, and back to the previous slides, that we're asking individuals to not conform their life to education, but rather asking education to conform to sort of the broader life that individuals are experiencing. So as we think about this, we really do kind of look at a variety of different focus areas here within these 6 areas. We'll come back to this here a little bit later as we talk about sort of implication for practice. So wanted to spend a couple minutes here just kind of diving into who we see as the modern learner. And so when we look back at 2023 data, we saw that 61% of high school graduates enrolled nationally in a higher education institution immediately after graduation. This number looks different across the country. States like Texas, this number is in the 40s. Nationally, it's in the 60s. But, I think overall, we've had kind of a general acceptance that we as a nation have done a good job at expanding our access mission and having more individuals come into post-secondary education, especially right out of high school. That enrollment is mixed across the country. And so in a place like Texas, close to 70% of students will start in a community college setting. Nationally, 31% of undergraduates are enrolled in 2-year public colleges, and 45% are at 4-year institutions, with 18% at private 4 years and 7% at proprietary institutions. These numbers move a little bit annually, but if you think we've seen a drop off in proprietary school enrollment over the years, we've seen sort of some flat enrollment at our 2-year institutions, but we're seeing that bounce back up this year. And then we're seeing kind of a flat enrollment at our 4 years as well. But this is not, again, kind of a national picture as much as it should be viewed as a regional or local picture. And we talk a lot about sort of this enrollment cliff that we're experiencing. We had our highest year of high school graduates that we will probably ever have again last year. So it is downhill from there. But as we know about demographics, that isn't the same across the country. That looks very different state by state, or even, kind of urban versus rural areas across individual states. And so the enrollment pattern is shifting. As we think about this, though, there's 2 levers, right? There's the number of individuals that are going direct from high school to college. And so even if the number of high school graduates goes down, the lever there is to try to get more to go to college. But the second level is the number of individuals that need to sort of go back and continue to experience post-secondary education. And so overall, we're bullish, quote unquote, if you will, on the post-secondary education market, because we do still see a lot of room for growth within the market. It just isn't really going to be coming in the same way from our traditional high school graduates, but rather it's going to be that broader nonlinear progression that individuals are going through to go to post-secondary education. So about 1 in 5 students indicated that they indicate across the country that they are a parent, which is higher than I think a lot of folks, kind of anticipate. And this speaks to sort of that nonlinear pathway of people are going at a later point in life. We also know that about 70% of undergraduates work while enrolled, and of those that worked, about over 40%, 43% indicate that they work 40 hours or more per week. 44% of undergraduates agreed or strongly agreed that it is important to support their family while they are enrolled in college. And 36% of undergraduates who worked while enrolled considered themselves to be workers who go to school rather than students who work. And that number there is, kind of higher in our community college setting. It's about 45%. It's in the 20s for our 4-year institutions. At the same time, kind of our kind of financing picture, as I mentioned, has changed fairly drastically. And so in Texas, for example, if an individual wanted to attend either a public 4-year or a public 2-year institution, the average Pell Award would cover just 19% of their total cost of attendance for the year. And so I think a lot of people are surprised that there isn't more of a differential between our 2-year and 4-year partners. But when we think about both the Pell Award as well as the overall cost of attendance, we do see that there is kind of a similar coverage of 19% across the two sector types. We also know that for individuals to cover the minimum cost of 2 semesters at a public institution through minimum wage work alone, that we would need to work over 80 hours per week for 4-year enrollment and over 60 hours per week for enrollment at 2-year institutions. And this is a factor, 2 factors here. One is the rising cost of education. Two is the relatively stagnant minimum wage. Prevailing wage that would look a little different than minimum wage. But what it does speak to is this idea that we aren't really able to work our way through college in the way that many folks may expect, or at least the part of the public discourse may ask for people to do. And then when we think about, cost of attendance, this speaks to kind of these changes in sort of tuition versus non-tuition expenses. We've done a really good job of holding tuition and fees costs flat, especially given that we've needed to continue to increase sort of our costs of delivering education. But you're at public 4-year institutions, on average, about 36% of the cost of attendance is going to tuition and fees. 60%, though, is going to food, housing, and other expenses, and then 4% about to books and supplies. And so, again, the bulk of that cost of attendance really is cost of living, which has been increasing since the pandemic. And so we continue to see sort of financial pressure that students are experiencing throughout that enrollment process. Despite, kind of all of the challenges with enrolling in school, our modern learners have a really strong perception of their institutions. And so 40% would recommend their school to prospective students. 73% of undergraduates agree that the cost of college is a good investment in their financial future. And 84% of undergraduates believe that earning a college degree will lead to a higher quality of life. As we think about sort of these modern learner perceptions, I think 2 things are pretty important to call out. One is that when we think about the cost of college being a good investment in their financial future, this is of currently enrolled students. And so when we see this number being higher than maybe what you would see in a Gallup poll or a general public poll, it's because the individuals are enrolled. And so we would hope that that number is higher. The second piece of that, though, is that this also tends to be when students are most optimistic about their financial future, is when they are enrolled. And so, as we think about both how much they owe as well as what their potential earning opportunities are, this kind of current enrollment period should be a very optimistic one. And so we still have a fourth of individuals who are not agreeing with that statement that it's a good investment in their financial future. And we would also anticipate that after students, kind of experience post-secondary education with or without a degree or credential, that number may drop. The second piece to consider is kind of this broader delta here between the number of undergraduates that believe earning a college degree will lead to a higher quality of life and those that believe it's a good investment in their financial future. And so same survey population here, more individuals indicating that it would lead to a higher quality of life. A lot of how we talk about the value of post-secondary education right now is very financially driven, which is the one kind of quantitative metric that we have to assess degrees or credentials. But we are seeing students that are overall indicating that there will be a higher quality of life that they will experience because they have a degree or credential, and that's separate, from even the conversation about it being a good investment in their financial future. And so there's some intangibles there that are worth exploring as we think about a value conversation for post-secondary education. So we also started to talk to students a lot since fall of 2021 about anxiety and depression. And so kind of the backdrop of all of this about post-secondary education is the broader societal changes that have been going on. And so starting in 2021, we asked about generalized anxiety disorder and major depressive disorder from tens of thousands of learners across the country. And what you'll see here is that our generalized anxiety disorder likely has held pretty steady around 45% of the enrolled student population since 2021. Major depressive has changed a little bit, but is in that sort of 33-34% range, coming down from the pandemic, right? So we did see a little bit of a correction on the major depressive disorder, but overall holding kind of around that 35% here since the middle of the pandemic in fall of 2021. Um, as we look at this, I think it's important to use this as kind of a backdrop for some of the things that we talk about within the modern learner, and that there is a high level of stress and anxiety that students are experiencing. Some of this is tied to education and future. Some of this is also just tied to the broader challenges and pressures of daily life. And so we can't view sort of these educational choices in a vacuum. They need to be viewed in the context of an individual's broader life. And I think, we think that this is a pretty important data point to really begin to focus in on. So wanted to hone in on two. We talk about sort of these changing personas for modern learners, and we wanted to hone in on kind of two different personas for individuals that are increasingly showing as becoming a primary persona over that of being a student. And the first is those who are working, and the second is those who are caregiving. And so for the first one here with students that are working well enrolled, as we've talked to students around the country, only 5% of students have indicated that they are able to rely solely on personal savings or current wages to pay for school. And so most students are using some form of financial aid or credit to go through their educational experiences. This whole idea, again, back to self-pay with the number of hours worked is something that just is not feasible or attainable for the vast majority of students throughout that process. The next slide here then kind of thinks about, how many people are working well enrolled. And we used this stat earlier, but about 2/3 of respondents reported that they were working well enrolled. And your blue line here is 2-year, your orange line is 4-year. So we get a lot of conversation here about, it's 2-year students that end up working while they're enrolled. And what you'll see is 66% of 2-year students, 68% of 4-year students are indicating that they are working while they're enrolled, with about 30% of both saying that they are not. Where we begin to see some differences is in terms of the number of jobs and the numbers of hours that individuals work. And so our 2-year students are more likely to have one job. About 80% have one job. About 70% of 4-year students have one job. But about a fourth of individuals in 4-year institutions have two jobs. And about 19% of those in 2-year institutions have two jobs. What this continues to impact is what I mentioned earlier, which is this idea of time poverty. And so as we increase the number of employers, we increase the complexity of scheduling and working those jobs, which can lead to increased time poverty that students would experience throughout that process as they're trying to manage kind of school and work opportunities throughout that period. And then we ask students, how many days during the average school year, how many hours do you spend in a typical 7-day week during the school year working for pay? This is where we see a flip sort of in the direction of our 2-year partners, with about half of, or 48% of 2-year students indicating that they worked 40 or more hours per week for pay. 40% of 2-year students also indicated that they were working in that 20 to 39 hour range for pay. So that's about 80% almost of students in 2-year institutions working 20 plus hours a week. About 37% of 4-year students indicated 40 or more hours per week, and the same for the 20 to 39 hour block there as well. So still super high numbers. And I think especially in that 40 hour per week bucket, elevated numbers for 4-year students over what many people would anticipate, which again kind of is where we go back to sort of this modern learner piece. Is not just individuals that are enrolled at 2-year institutions, but also seeing quite a bit of this at 4-year institutions as well. Most of the literature that we have around student employment speaks to the value of working kind of in that 20-hour a week range. And so we see, many, many students that are exceeding the number of hours that traditionally have been tied to increased academic outcomes. When we break this down by full versus part-time status, what we'll see here is that the vast majority of individuals that are kind of working 40 hours per week, about 56% of them are part-time students. A third still are full-time students and full-time employees, right, if you will. So still a very, very high number there, but still more that are falling into that 40 or more category per week. The second piece here, around this 20 to 39 hour, we see a pretty good split. And then again, kind of the less than 20 hours is predominantly more so our full-time students. We talk a lot about this value, sort of, if you will, of work-based learning as a high-impact practice, and there is a lot of support for that conceptually. One of the challenges, I think, as this slide articulates very well, is that our students are already working. And so asking students to pause their education or kind of pause their employment experience to take on an internship or some other form of, kind of work-based learning may impact their ability to not only support themselves and others, but may also impact their ability to continue to go back to work in those employment environments that are essential for them to be able to meet their not only academic expenses, but basic needs expenses. As a part of this, we've asked students, are you a worker who goes to school or a student who works? And we are now at a point, like I mentioned earlier, where about 36% of students are identifying themselves as workers who go to school rather than students who work. This number continues to grow, higher in that 2-year sector than in the 4-year sector, but still over a fourth of individuals in that 4-year sector are identifying as a worker who goes to school rather than a student who works, which speaks to kind of this persona shift that we're experiencing in post-secondary education. Those who are workers or identify as workers are more likely to work 40 hours or more per week. 67% are there. And then they are also more likely to say that their job or jobs interfere with their ability to engage in extracurricular or social events at school. And so it kind of does begin to change sort of this perception of what is a campus environment and how do we support students through extracurriculars and other components when we're balancing, again, this time poverty of a high level of employment with a high level of academic engagement as well. So as I mentioned before, 18% of students also indicate that they are student parents, and this is a increasingly visible percentage or kind of population of students on campuses. We've seen many states that are now passing student parent specific legislation, including data collection legislation related to student parents. And so when we kind of overlay these personas, employment, caregiving, and student, we asked, do you provide financial support for any of the following individuals? Workers here are in blue, students are in orange. And so about a quarter of those who identify as a worker who goes to school support a spouse, as opposed to 8% of students, 35% a child or children compared to 11. And then you'll see parent and guardian and other family members are also elevated. And so we begin to stack sort of these personas and say, not only are you a worker who goes to school, but you're also more likely to be a caregiver as well. And when we then add in sort of for our caregivers, those who are working and providing care for dependents do see sort of larger barriers to academic progress. And mainly that's because they've missed class for a variety of reasons. And so about a fourth of students miss class because of a conflict with a job. About the same percentage of student parents indicated that they missed a class due to a lack of childcare, and then about 15% of students across sectors indicated that they had a lack of reliable transportation. And so again, we see kind of these basic needs elements, but also these persona elements rising to create kind of inabilities to manage sort of the traditional academic schedule. The last thing that we wanted to touch on here, sort of from a framing perspective, was student financing has changed for individuals. And this is even over the last decade. We've been collecting data on this since 2018. And so while in college, have you experienced any financial difficulties or challenges? You'll see about 3/4 of students indicated that they have. About half of students across sectors indicate that they have difficulty concentrating on schoolwork because of their financial situation. 56% of undergraduate students would have trouble getting $500 in cash or credit. So not just cash or credit to meet an unforeseen expense. And so again, we see a lot of financial fragility across the country. This is not just unique to students. If we look at kind of broader surveys of American consumers, we're going to see similar emergency fund savings, for example, here. But our students, this is a very acute challenge. And so we asked students, this was from our 2024 instrument, but since January 1st, 2024, approximately how many times did you run out of money? About a quarter of two-year students and 19% of four-year students indicated that they ran out of money more than 8 times per year, which to us is a structural kind of budget deficit, if you will, where they're continuing to run out of cash. But about another fifth of students were running out of money 4 to 7 times a year, which may kind of run across an academic schedule. And so we know that students are one, kind of in a budget deficit from a month to month or a quarter to quarter perspective. But then two, also don't have the emergency fund to come up with $500 in the case of cash or credit. And so nearly 3 in 5 students have experienced food or housing insecurity or homelessness in the past 12 months. It's about 60% of students across the country. These numbers carry at both 2 and 4-year institutions, and they have stayed relatively stagnant from fall of 2020 to fall of 2024. And so we know that sort of this chronic food and housing insecurity is a part of the student experience in many campuses. As we think about this, we have varying levels of food and housing insecurity. And so there's a lot to unpack here. And we do a lot of presentations and reports on sort of the differences between low and very low food security and housing insecurity. But our team has also done a lot of work to understand that this isn't really a static state for students and that they move in and out of this as their financial circumstances change. And so there's a lot of this that, again, kind of our student population mirrors our broader public population in terms of how they are engaging or receiving the support services that they need to stay enrolled. Many of you might be familiar with the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund, or HERF, which was emergency aid that was put in place through the COVID pandemic bills. We see here that about 44% of students in fall of 2021 in our sample took a look at had received emergency aid from their institution. That fell to 4% in fall of 2024. These are not the same institutions, not longitudinal in any way, but it does show that there's been a large drop off once those HERF dollars left the system. And this goes back to this idea of our financial aid system is super linear in nature. What we don't have is a very reactive financial aid system. And so when students experience these emergencies, like that $500 in cash or credit for maybe a blown tire or a laptop that might have died, there aren't those support services like emergency aid here to turn to help get support to stay enrolled in school. And oftentimes those small dollar balances, $500, $750, might be the difference between somebody staying enrolled and stopping out of their degree or credential pathway. We also asked students starting in fall of 2020 about receiving public assistance. That number jumped during the pandemic and now came back to about a fourth of students receiving some form of public assistance here in fall of 2024. We've seen a lot of efforts to increase SNAP and other kind of data sharing provisions that help more students to access public benefits. This continues, though, to be a challenge as we think about sort of the intersectionality of public benefits and tuition, because there is so much state flexibility in terms of how these programs are administered. And we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of the reforms that are kind of necessary to think about holistic affordability for students. One of the things that we spend a lot of time talking about is student debt, and rightfully so. We've seen a huge increase in the amount of student debt that individuals achieve. Or that individuals take on, excuse me. But what we don't talk as much about is credit card debt. And so 57% of respondents in our annual Student Financial Wellness Survey instrument indicated that they used a credit card during 2024. 89% of credit card users has used it to pay for basic necessities like food, housing, or transportation. We then asked students, do you pay off your credit card on time? And good news is 3/4 of individuals that use their credit card for basic needs said they made that payment on time. 82% of those who did not use it for basic needs indicated that they made their payment on time. But then we asked them, do you fully pay off your credit card balance each month? And again, this isn't necessarily different than the general kind of American populace, but 42% of those who used the credit card for basic needs said they paid it off in full. 54% of those who did not. So still over just about half of students are saying that they are not paying and they're carrying that revolving debt with them from month to month. And so when we think about kind of more kind of acute forms of financial concern, credit card debt is a big component of that. We also still see about little over 5% of students that are using payday loans and auto title loans. But we have also recently seen, and this probably isn't surprising to anybody who's consumed things over the last few years, but we are seeing a pretty large increase in the number of students that are using buy now, pay later services as kind of a short-term debt focus. And so a lot of other borrowing outside of just student loans that our students are engaging with, and worthwhile to take a look at kind of the role that plays in a nonlinear pathway as people start to stop in and out of post-secondary education. So just a couple things here as we kind of think about, okay, what are the implications for our institutions and for our systems? Three kind of populations that we're really taking a look at here. The first is our learners themselves, and thinking about what are the implications for learners, and a couple things that we're really narrowing in on. The first is that we're entering into, and probably have been in now for a period of time, a very unstable employment environment. And a part of this is due to the shortened half-life of skills. So skills, especially technical skills, break down at a much quicker rate than they ever have in history. And no better example of this than just 5 or 6 years ago, we were telling everybody to go to school for coding and make sure that you get a credential in software, computer science or software engineering. We now see those entry-level jobs evaporating, right, as AI takes over. Same thing with accounting and other kind of very technical kind of fields and skill sets. There's a broader societal challenge for what do we do with internships and entry-level jobs as AI can increasingly do those functions. But for the learner, this requires us to continuously update our skills and to move forward in a way that keeps us ahead of that technological and particular evolution of skills. We're also seeing an increase in provider availability. And so it used to be you were comparing a community college maybe with a online provider or a local four-year institution, but now you're also comparing for training purposes, comparing not just against traditional education, but you're also comparing against Amazon AWS certificates or Google Grow with Google certificates. And you're also comparing, against kind of direct to consumer things as well. So you're kind of, in a short sense, YouTube, kind of YouTube or TikTok or other kind of learning channels. In a more formal sense, anybody can really issue a credential now. And so you can get a badge or a micro credential that can be issued by Trellis Strategies, for example. And there isn't really a differentiation in terms of the quality of those certificates. We're seeing continued financial pressure, and sort of as that labor market tightens here, this refined need, if you will, for a value signal in the market. Our institutions have different pressures, right? We're now thinking more about how do we reduce the friction for learners to start and stop in post-secondary education more frequently? How do we provide quality signals that build trust and try to replace some of the trust that we as an industry may have lost? How do we increase our acceptance of prior learning opportunities, which make those on-ramps easier and provide an enrollment differentiator in the market? And then how do we make sure that we have rapidly deployed new skill frameworks that maintain kind of a core critical thinking infrastructure, because the pendulum will swing back to critical thinking at some point, over sort of these technical vocational skills, and that we need to make sure that we're evolving those skill frameworks at a very rapid pace, which we traditionally haven't done. And then more broadly, from a system perspective, we need to kind of create an environment that allows for flexible financing. We need to increase our incentives for credit portability. We need to reduce the friction for evaluating these previous experiences that learners bring us in post-secondary education. Then we need to use regional collaboration as kind of an opportunity to fill some of these federal policy gaps that we may have here for individuals. So when we think about what this super practically means, if you're on a campus, there's kind of four things that we're really touching on here. The first is that we need to provide opportunities for strategic course scheduling. And so the course, if people are trying to fit their lives into education instead of education fitting into their life, we need to have predictability in terms of when they're going to be offered classes. We need to have hybrid opportunities for them as well, so that they can fit work and childcare and other components around it. We need to think about how we flip this idea of work-based learning to be learning at work that we can bring back to the institutions, knowing that the majority of our students are working and that many of them are working 20 plus hours per week. We need to expand this financing infrastructure beyond just Title IV. So if cost of living is really our biggest driver of costs for individuals, we need to think about how are we supporting students through other public benefits that they're eligible for, like childcare subsidies, SNAP, SNAP ENT programs, TANF, other kind of public benefits programs that students may be eligible for. And then we need to think about how do we provide a better recognition of prior learning, whether that is bringing other transfer credits in, whether it's competency-based assessment of individual credits, or whether it's skill validation and verification. And so these are kind of four things that we're looking at within each campus. We have kicked off sort of four key priority projects. One is a regional Some College No Credential initiative building off of our national Some College No Credential work. This will be a pilot in North Texas that looks at re-enrolling students at any institution in the region instead of just the institution that they had previously been enrolled at. We're working right now with a state agency on the integration of childcare resources into their onboarding process for students in their community and technical college systems. We are looking at a regional credit portability initiative that would opt in to sharing sort of these learning opportunities that would make sure that if you received an experience that was granted credit at a community college, that it could go to a four-year institution. And then finally, we're doing a lot of skill verification work to take a look at shorter term programs, engaging sort of the industry alignment and making sure that we're able to validate the learning as a part of that process. I went through a lot of this very quickly because I was trying to make up some time here, but more than happy to answer any questions that anybody has. I know that we will be sending out these slides here as a follow-up. But would also note that from our perspective, we would be remiss to not acknowledge that this is an evolving framework. And so we're kind of putting forward this idea of a modern learner framework in response to the idea that learners and systems are changing. And we feel that institutions, post-secondary education needs to evolve and change. So therefore, that framework also needs to evolve and change as well throughout that process. And so more than happy, like I said here, my email address is available. I know many of you on the call also have other contacts within our Trellis team. Would highly encourage sort of any kind of outreach or feedback on how we're thinking about these learners throughout the process. So I know we have a minute or two more. Like I said, more than happy to answer any questions. Thank you all for dealing with kind of the technical difficulties on the front end here. Sorry about the speed of the presentation to try to get through the content that we did have for today. But appreciate everybody hanging in there this afternoon, and thank you all for joining us.